From the Beatles to the Rolling Stones to Guns N' Roses, we've all heard a song or two from these iconic rock and roll bands. But what not everyone is educated on is how they came to be. Where did these bands find their style and influences? And who came before and after them in their genre? Rock and roll has evolved into many different things and changed so much since its origination. And today, that's what I'm going to be talking about. We all know rock and roll today, but how did it get here? To start from the beginning, rock and roll came about in the early 1950s, and it seemed as to be a stylistic hybrid of electric blues, jazz, country, gospel, and R&B music. It started off with its new sound, and it had heavy reliance on classic blues structures with added electric guitars and steady drum beats that were catchy and could be danced to. As for the name rock and roll, it was said to be created by a radio disc jockey from Cleveland, Ohio named Alan Freed on his show titled Moondog Show, which was followed by a wide audience of black and white teenagers. A few artists acted as pioneers for rock and roll during this decade, and they included people such as Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, Bill Haley, and Chuck Berry. Part of why rock and roll was so popular was because the 1950s were a rather conservative time period, and it broke the mold of the safe topics that were talked about in pop music, and instead it shared ideas such as sexual freedom and rebellion of the youth. It then quickly dominated the music charts because it finally gave teenagers their own music that they could claim and resonate with. In the next decade, rock and roll did not fade away, and it continued to dominate the charts, which proved people wrong as they thought that it would be just a fad. During the 60s, rock also grew into more diverse with its styles and artists. This can be heavily accredited by Motown and Atlantic Records, as they brought more African American artists to the forefront, and then girl groups also started to form. One unique style that came about and gained popularity in rock and roll during this time was surf music. This can be accredited with the surf culture that was very popular in areas such as Southern California, and it then led to fame for groups such as the Beach Boys. Also, by the mid-60s, the American youth had begun to gain interest in not only American artists, but British artists and groups as well, such as the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. This was the beginning of the madness that would be called the British Invasion. The British Invasion was a movement in the 60s where British rock and roll groups' popularity spread rapidly across the U.S. Many people even go as far to say that the official start date for the British Invasion was on February 7, 1964, when the Beatles landed at LaGuardia Airport in New York. It all started with the Beatles, as they were a national sensation and pretty much ended all older American bands except for the Beach Boys and the Four Seasons. They also caused new groups to start copying the British styles as they lusted after the level of fame that the Beatles had reached, and this included aspects such as added harmonies and rhyme, making it extremely catchy. The primary bands of the British Invasion were the Beatles, the Who, the Rolling Stones, and the Bee Gees. After the British Invasion, rock and roll began to just be referred to as rock, and it also started to mellow out and have a more relaxed feel as a result of the Vietnamese War coming to an end. Some prominent events of the decade were the Beatles breaking up and going on as solo acts for the next few years, as well as the deaths of Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, and later on John Lennon. Disco was also huge in the 70s because people desired music that they could dance to. Rock was breaking off into many different subcategories such as hard rock, soft rock, punk rock, glam rock, and many other styles. Punk rock was popular because it was fast-paced and it commonly addressed political issues. Some of these bands included the Ramones and the Sex Pistols. The 80s were more focused around harder rock bands and metal, which included Guns N' Roses, Aerosmith, and Metallica. Glam rock was super popular during this decade too, because it was considered a form of self-expression. A notable feature of glam rock was always the outrageous hairstyles and sometimes even makeup, and some examples of these groups were Queen and Wizard. The 90s was a huge time for alternative rock. Dance and party music were no longer popular at this time because people are now fans of grunge, which had strong guitar, feedback, and lots of guitar riffs. A ton of grunge and alternative rock bands became popular, such as Nirvana, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Green Day, and Radiohead. As for present day, rock music is still very popular, but has lots of differences. There are still many subgenres of rock, each with their own loyal fan bases, but the most popular among the youth would probably be alternative rock and pop rock. All the way back since the 1950s, rock has heavily impacted all music, and continues to do so today. There have been countless phases and styles that the genre has gone through, and each of them have helped to richen the history of rock and roll as a whole. When comparing rock and roll from the beginning until now, it can seem so different. But you just have to look and focus for the similarities in the heart of the music. People constantly have the debate over which they think is better, old rock or new rock. But I think that's up for each individual to decide.